Class Conflict, Competition, and State Functions by Heide Gerstenberger. It seems time to point out that the development of the historical materialist theory of the state has still not got very far. Furthermore, the theoretical approaches that have been tried do not offer any firm basis for future work. So far, the discussion of the problematic of the constitution of the bourgeois state has been generally characterized by an over-hasty analysis in various, quote, derivations, end quote, of the relation between economics and politics. In fact, the reason for the inadequate conceptualizations of this relation on which the theories rest is that until now in the state theory discussion, reality has been looked at only in order to provide a mere illustration of any given theory. The theoretical basis for a concrete analysis of the bourgeois state have not yet been established, and it seems doubtful whether they can in fact be built by continuing along the lines developed so far. These doubts will be developed below. They form the basis for some suggestions for a strategy for further research, but these suggestions do not claim to add to the systematic approaches already mentioned, yet another view of the theoretical foundations of the bourgeois state. Despite many differences in detail, the existing theoretical analysis of the state can be divided into three main groups. They will not be set out in detail here yet again. That has been done many times recently, but will only be discussed in order to consider how far they can provide us with a theoretical preparation for concrete analysis. The starting point, represented by Sibylle von Flatow and Frerk Huysken, as well as by the Munich AK, sees the foundation of the bourgeois state in the particular relationship which people have with each other in bourgeois society. The state for them is not to be derived from the general concept of capital, since in the latter, individuals cannot be contained as citizens. It can only be derived from the economic forms of intercourse and the relationships between people which these forms create on the surface of bourgeois society. But at the level of appearance of bourgeois society, the economic forms of intercourse present themselves as those of simple commodity circulation, and people appear as possessors of various revenue sources. For Flatow and Huysken, the bourgeois state is derived from the common interest in a high income. For the AK, it is based on the recognition of contradictory special interests. But both views start from the premise that the theory of the state can be adequately developed at the level of systematic explanation. For this form of historical materialism, history does not exist. But if, as the AK correctly state, there cannot be an adequate theoretical explanation of the state on the basis of its empirically ascertainable functions, then equally its systematic explanation should not stand in contradiction to historical reality. Only those who deny the importance of class struggles and thus of history for theory can run the risk as theoreticians of being duped by current issues, as has happened to these theoreticians. If today a largely integrated working class sees the state actually as the protector of its interests, this is in no way proved to be the case for the whole duration of bourgeois society. Workers on strike who in the 19th century and even in the 20th were attacked by armed and mounted police presumably had little experience of the recognition by the bourgeoisie of their particular interest. It is just as difficult to reconcile this conception of the state with the long periods of fascist and authoritarian bourgeois rule. The theoretical transposition of conditions of simple commodity circulations into political forms of intercourse is based on a reasoning which, because it is unhistorical, is short-circuited. It is the particular form of the bourgeois state, which results from the economic forms of intercourse, that form which distinguishes it from all other states. To that extent, we can agree with the writers we have mentioned. In fact, the very basis of this form is that the economic movements on the surface of bourgeois society appear as those of simple commodity circulation, for as distinct from other forms of exploitation, the capitalist form consists precisely in converting labor power into a commodity which circulates freely. The coercive character of this society consists in ensuring that the possessors of the commodity labor power are in a position to take only its exchange value to market. Hence, the class character of the bourgeois state is also established as soon as the state does not distinguish between the possessors of different, quote, revenue sources, end quote. It's thundering outside if you can hear it. What can be ascertained from the analysis of the surface of bourgeois society, aside from the preconditions for commodity circulation itself, hence for the reproduction of capital, is the conclusion that the state must guarantee the phenomenal form of economic movements as being that of simple circulation, but the conditions for this guarantee are given too much theoretical weight, while the social reproduction of relations of production is correspondingly underestimated. It is not ideology that is the most important stabilizing factor, but rather the naked force that lurks behind the form of appearance. Thus it is not definitely settled that the capitalist mode of production requires formal equality, universal suffrage, and democratic structures. True, Marx's early writings, which these writers frequently refer to, do tend toward such, quote, determined, end quote, conclusions. But these works arose from the development of a concrete strategy for emancipation and from the point of view of what forms of bourgeois rule would offer the best preconditions for the preparation of the socialist revolution. Introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, on the Jewish question, etc. Any reliance on Marx's early works for theoretical purposes must take into account both this strategic moment and the period in which they were written. Once historical and systematic analysis are harmonized, the necessary correspondence of economic and political forms of intercourse in bourgeois society is much reduced. What must be maintained is the illusion that the bourgeois state is functional, and connected with this, the illusion of the universality of the norm. The precondition for the stabilization of bourgeois society is not that the state actually appears as the guarantor of all interests, but that it should seem possible to make it become such a guarantor, and this, no less, is also the content of revisionism, which provides a theoretical justification for the actual integration of the working class into bourgeois society. The stabilization of bourgeois society does not require the existence of, but only the struggle for, universal suffrage, and since the actual implementation of formal freedom and formal equality in the end undermines the hopes which could, prior to that, be placed in the improvement of the bourgeois system, it is not at all to be seen as the guarantor of stability for this society, but rather the precondition for momentous convulsions. The explanation of the functions of the state in relation to valorization has become more influential for the current debate than the derivation of the bourgeois state from the surface of bourgeois society. Although seldom thought through in the theories, it is clearest in Avatar. This approach has nevertheless shaped the whole of the debate on the left in recent years. Admittedly, the manifold restrictions on the activity of the state have been repeatedly analyzed in the meantime, but in the discussion of state functions, the aims of state activity are still treated as the adequate expression of a situation of valorization, for the most part still viewed as limited to economics. Since class rule has found its organizational embodiment in the state, it is deduced not only that the interests of capital prevail in class conflicts, usually quoted to illustrate the functional relation between valorization and state activity, but it is also fundamentally implied without discussion that the interests of capital are represented by the state. This must then mean that the real structure of national capital finds in the activity of the state the representation adequate to it at any moment. The analysis of the bourgeois state is thus conceived of as the continuation of the analysis of capital. First of all, the average or mean form of the state is developed from the general theory of capital. This analysis is then supposed to ascend to the concrete by explaining concrete state functions from the concrete movements of accumulation. But since at present the analysis of the concrete processes of accumulation is still not very advanced, the concrete development of the bourgeois state is generally in a supplementary way still derived from those general conditions of the capitalist mode of production, above all from the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which, however, as such, give precisely no information about their concrete historical content. However, the historical development of the function of the state can even less validly be derived directly from general theory than this can be done for the concrete development of the process of accumulation. It is wrong to believe that a breakthrough in the general theory of the state will at last enable us to derive the politics of the family, of education, or of welfare with satisfying finality from the conditions of valorization. Is the obvious starting point for materialist analyses of the state that a relationship exists between the movement of capital and the activity of the state. The assertion of such a general relationship does no more than remind us of the basic research strategy formulated by Marx in 1859 in the preface to the Critique of Political Economy. That is to say, that concrete analysis consists precisely in working out in every particular how such That is to say that concrete analysis consists precisely in working out in every particular how such relationships are produced, and the reference to class struggle is no solution to the difficulty unless it has a decisive effect on the actual analytical approach. Class struggles and concrete competition strategies grow out of conditions of valorization and take place in the framework of a definite political structure. The assumption that out of such conflicts there is established an exact correspondence between the situation of capital valorization and the activity of the state, or even that the state can in general be characterized as the administrator of a concrete collective interest of capital. These are suppositions with which we have not only made the realistic analysis of the state superstructure much too easy for ourselves, but also with which we deny the historical importance of concrete class struggles. The assumption that state activity, at least at the outset, can in general be characterized as functional for capital as a whole could be theoretically justified in three ways. First, it could be argued that the representation of different interests not only leads to an ascendancy of capitalist interest, but that differences in the interest of capital also result in a compromise of interest among the capital fractions, which would coincide with or approximate to the interest of capital as a whole. But this implies processes of compromise which even in periods of pre-monopoly capitalism would correspond only to a model of bourgeois society and to faith in the working of a, quote, invisible hand, end quote. The interest of capital as a whole could perhaps be said to have resulted from concrete struggles most nearly in those instances analyzed by Marx in an exemplary way in his chapter on the 8-hour day, in the struggle of the working class over the conditions of reproduction of their labor power. But here, too, it is questionable whether, with the increasing inequality of their development, the individual capitals are not confronted in very different ways with the conditions of reproduction conceded through struggle, e.g. in service training, or whether particular demands of this kind could not even transcend the conditions of reproduction of capitalistically exploited labor power. The second possible argument that the interest of capital as a whole is expressed through the activity of the state comes from the competition between nation-states. Competition on the world market is one of the basic characteristics of the concrete historical development of capitalism, and state organization is a vital instrument of world market competition strategies. This nation-state argument does have something to be said for it, for we can safely assume that both governments and officials of the future state administrative apparatus are conscious of the responsibility of ensuring the competitiveness of national capital on the world market, a responsibility which today must generally lead to the needs of so-called growth industries being given special treatment in state measures, even if we do not start from the hypothesis of some of the Stamocap theoreticians of a of an alliance between monopolies and the state. I guess STEMOCAP means state monopoly capital. Theoreticians of an alliance between monopolies and the state, a result of the classical historical function of the bourgeois state of guaranteeing external representation, is that government departments must obtain information and advice from those representatives of capital who are important for the current position of the nation on the world economy. Yet such a general line of thought does not tell us much about concrete state activity. It cannot take into account a case where leading capitals are compelled to make contradictory demands of the state. Cf. the energy crisis. Nor does it help us to indicate what concrete decisions might be taken when it comes to establishing the competitive position on the world market of a particular branch through state support. And lastly, it completely ignores the necessity for state authorities to balance the needs of competitiveness on the world market against internal political stability. To characterize the concrete results of such a balancing process generally as the adequate expression of the current interests of capital as a whole would again involve a series of fairly objectionable assumptions. The third conceivable possibility of establishing an adequate correspondence between the interests of capital as a whole and the activity of the state has been foreshadowed and comes back to the role of officials of the state apparatus. At one stage in the debate on the political economy of education, it was thought that substantial relationships could be proved by showing personal links, e.g. of members of the scientific council with certain capital interests. To expose individuals as the puppets of definite interest is quite inadequate for the analysis of real relationships, and moreover, it is virtually irrelevant. The connection between the state apparatus and capital interest is indeed established partly through the typical selection and socialization processes described in particular by Miliband, and also to some extent through conscious obligations, but in systematic terms, what is relevant above all is the connection that necessarily establishes itself behind the backs of the persons concerned. And this necessity is mediated in the developed bourgeois state through the voting mechanism. A government will only be elected or re-elected if a majority of the electorate hopes that it will pursue their interest in a way that is sometimes rather loosely understood. Unless they are willing to do entirely without the acclamation of the ballot, governments must try to maintain the appearance of neutrality in various ways. They are also, as capitalism develops, increasingly obliged to alleviate its crisis-ridden character. That members of the government and officials in the administrative apparatus are both fully conscious of the task of crisis management is a fact that can certainly be taken into account in the analysis of the state. However, in the present stage of capitalism, this does not only mean, in very general terms, the favoring of the interest of capital over those of wage earners. The aim is rather to improve the profitability of particular capitals and fractions of capital due to the importance of competition on the world market. As regards the analysis of the occurrence of state activity, we thus find ourselves once more at the point reached earlier. It is only possible to trace a mere outline of the occurrence of this activity, unless we can ascribe to the state of apparatus a quasi-mystical knowledge of the concrete interests at any given time of capital as a whole. I gotta open the window. It's hot. In opposition to the dominant contemporary approaches, the AK have correctly pointed out that the analytical decomposition of the state into economic categories theoretically denies the particularization of the state from bourgeois society. For them, it follows from this that the analysis of the state must start from the phenomenal forms in which the movements of capital present themselves on the surface of bourgeois society. But this adhesion in theory to the inverted appearance of bourgeois society unnecessarily restricts the analysis of the state. That the movements of capital could present themselves as those of simple circulation on the surface of bourgeois society was not only an historical achievement in the phase of primitive accumulation, but also necessitates constant state action. This is because the surface reproduction of capital is the precondition for the reproduction of the particular appearance of bourgeois society. And in every phase of bourgeois society, this has required state measures, contrary to simplified stages models. For this reason, the analysis of state functions is an essential part of a historical materialist theory of the state. This analysis does not provide a complete explanation of the bourgeois state, and it also remains unsatisfactory unless it actually brings into theoretical analysis both class struggles and the level of mediation through which the movement of capital and state action are related. More on this below. A further approach to the analysis of the state has recently been put forward by Heide Gerstenberger. It is also to be found in a similar form in the work of Erlich K. Preuss on the development of the German Constitution. Hochberger's view that the class character of the bourgeois state is not satisfactorily established in existing works. The derivation of the state from the logic of the economic system, he writes, means that a class nature must be attributed to the state without any mediation whatever. This shows, he says, the limits of a purely logical analysis and makes it clear, quote, where history comes in, end quote. He then develops this approach in particular by elaborating on the difference between the administrative apparatus and the forms of intercourse in bourgeois society. He argues that the bureaucratic apparatus originates as a class instrument to carry out proletarianization during primitive accumulation. Consequently, the automation of state power must be the result of the situation of class struggle in capital's primitive accumulation phase. Apart from the historical objection that a separate administrative institution can be shown to have originated in much earlier historical periods, it is only an historical proof of the class character of the bourgeois state to show correctly that the state apparatus was an instrument of class struggle during primitive accumulation. But historical analysis only tells us about structures, not about the necessity for structures to exist. What distinguishes the phase of primitive accumulation from that of the development of bourgeois society is that it has an overt class character. But just because it was overt at the start does not suffice to explain its existence in a later camouflaged form, and materialist analysis is inadequate so long as it... One second. God damn it. Now, where was I? And materialist analysis is inadequate so long as it cannot decipher the class character which lies in the very universality of the law, in the universality of the norm. In spite of this criticism, 2 points in this decidedly historical approach are worth noting. First, its objection to the claim implied by systematic derivation to seek to comprehend all phenomenon of the bourgeois state from the conditions of bourgeois society alone. In fact, the creation of the institutional apparatus precedes the establishment of bourgeois society, and in view of the fact that the state is not a direct component of the capitalist mode of production, we cannot take it for granted that there do not cling to it features which can be accounted for by the conditions of its formation. Hence, the approach we have cited leads us to the following thought. If the political sphere in bourgeois society must in fact be analyzed as one separated in a certain way from the economic, and accordingly, if the categories for this analysis are not available fully formed from the developed general theory of capital, then it would seem necessary to a limited extent, since the particularization of the state does not break through the general social framework, To repeat that process of research which precedes the analysis of capital, the process of historical material and the processing of historical material and the critique of bourgeois theory. What this implies is a certain skepticism towards striving for a systematic theoretical structure in the current state of this debate. The state, as the precondition for the reproduction of the community, develops in relation to the social division of labor and simultaneously with the regional demarcation of production. Also, the character of class domination is extracted and conferred on the state by all sorts of exploitative oppression. Marx and Engels worked with both of these formulations. This does not mean that the analysis of the state is completely absorbed into a form analysis of bourgeois society. Rather, what the latter is concerned with is the particular form which is assumed by the state in bourgeois society. Quote, "It is always the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers, a relation always naturally corresponding to a definite stage in the development of the methods of labor and thereby its social productivity, which reveals the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure, and with it the political form of the relation of sovereignty and dependence, in short, the corresponding specific form of the state." End quote. During the period of its formation, the bourgeois state distinguished itself from earlier forms of state, at first only as regards its functions and not in its basic structure. It formed the organization for carrying out the common interest of the ruling classes and for the institutionalization of a new system of economic exploitation. At the stage of primitive accumulation, the state can, therefore, be described as a committee for managing the common affairs of the ruling classes, a description which the Communist Manifesto polemically gives the state in relation to the whole bourgeois epoch. The oppressive character of the state in that period was as overt as in all previous forms of political organization. Why does the state change its form in the bourgeois epoch? Why does the state inform the state of society as a whole? This is the question which must be answered by analyzing the basic structures of bourgeois society. The formation of the specifically bourgeois form of the state is historically the result of primitive accumulation. Only after the state, in the form of an institution acting undisguisedly in the interest of the ruling classes, had furthered the proletarianization of a large part of the population, and the rapacious accumulation of capital, did it change its phenomenal form. For an amplification of this, see Gerstenberger, 1973. Capitalist relations of production are already established at that period, if not always very extensively. Therefore, it is no longer so much a matter of establishing, but rather of reproducing these relations. Whereas in all previous epochs of production, the overt fixing of power relations formed part of the process of reproduction. The reproduction of capitalist relations of production must take place as far as possible without the application of overt force. For the result of the establishment of the structure of exploitation in the form of an overt relation of force is the extensive immobilization of labor power. But this is very hard to reconcile with capitalist accumulation determined by competitive processes. Hence, the reproduction of capitalist relations of production does not merely presuppose the availability of labor power, which could already have been achieved by the forcible withdrawal of the means of subsistence. It also presupposes that workers should view their situation as not in any way brought about by force, but rather experience it as the result of an act of exchange into which they have brought their labor power. In previous historical epochs, personal misery could perhaps be understood as a punishment from God, but never before could the system of exploitation be rooted in the consciousness of the exploited in such a way that they had to understand their predicament as the consequence of their own incapacity, and as determined by the particular qualities of their labor power. The precondition for the reproduction of production relations to appear to the consciousness in this manner was historically, and is systematically, that the state should no longer overtly appear as the organization of the rulers. Once the state ceases to compel vagabonds and inmates of debtors' prisons forcibly into work, but comes forward as the guarantor of the quote legal, not the quote, excuse me, it's in parentheses, legal is in parentheses, regulation of exchange relationships. It formally withdraws from society and at the same time becomes the state of society as a whole. Historically, this process is expressed, for example, by the abolition of the estates, the establishment of the unmediated character of state power. What the state guarantees in this way is the appearance of freedom of contract, which comes to be expressed in bourgeois law. This appearance can, however, only be maintained because in wages it has a basis which can be materially experienced. Only because wages create the appearance that all work is paid for can the capital relation establish itself on the surface as an exchange relationship. The concealment is brought about not by the legal form, but by the capitalist mode of production. But since capitalism has succeeded in concealing the system of exploitation in the organization of production itself, it has become possible for the political legal regulation of relationships between people in bourgeois society to develop in formal abstraction from the social organization of production. Hence, the state does not indeed guarantee justice, but nothing more than the application of formal principles. Once we explain the abstraction of the political legal forms of intercourse from the structures of production as arising from the concealment of the relationship of exploitation by wages, we have already established the particularization of the state from society in the most general form of the bourgeois state. But this tells us very little about the concrete historical development of the bourgeois state. For from the form of the bourgeois state we cannot directly derive its functions. Rather, the relationship between form and function of the bourgeois state involves a contradiction. This grows out of the requirement of the capitalist mode of production not only for particular modes of intercourse, but at the same time for the provision of material preconditions of production. Their general character can be ascertained from the competition between capitals and between the national state groups of capital. Their particular form is a result of the historical concrete conditions of valorization of capital. These relationships have been discussed by Elmar Outvater. Or is it Outvater? I think it's Elmar Outvater is how you say that name. Common name, you see it all the time in leftist stuff, but I don't know how to pronounce it. But I think it's Elmar Outvater. Anyhooser. The provision of material, as opposed to legal formal conditions of production, requires economically determined state action. This creates a vital threat to the safeguarding of capitalist relations of production by means of the particularization of the state from society. There are three ways in which this contradiction between form and function in the bourgeois state is reconciled. Excuse me. 1. The formally equal participation of all citizens in the process of determining the collective will serves to conceal the class content of state measures concluded in legal form. We have already argued above that the struggle for equal participation can have the same effect. 2. The establishment of definite formal judicially reviewable procedures as operational standards for the bureaucracy serves to subject state action to the principle of the universal form. This does not in real terms establish any limitation on the scope for state action, as has been shown most clearly above all by Luhmann. 3. As a result of class struggles, state actions come to include not only formal but also real interests of the working class. Welfare state illusion. Although we cannot go into it here, we must point out that in the course of historical development it becomes necessary for an increasing amount of state business not to be channeled through legislative procedures in order to ensure the provision of the material preconditions of production. But at the same time, the bourgeois state, as a result of class conflicts, increasingly represents itself as the real defender of all interests. Thus, bourgeois society is able to secure the relations of production in a way which surpasses or increasingly replaces that which is constituted by the particularization of the bourgeois state from society. The first task of concrete analysis must be to show how the contradiction between the form and function of the bourgeois state unfolds concretely, and in what ways it is particularly reconciled. Only after an extensive process of historical research, which has hardly begun yet, will a systematic construction of theories be possible. The basis for this will not be provided by the kinds of historical description and attempts at systematization so far put forward by the proponents of the theory of state monopoly capitalism, nor do the critical discussions of these works provide a really adequate starting point. The rejection of the stages models of state monopoly capitalism theory does not free us from the necessity of working out what are the changes that result from the process of development of bourgeois society. We have generally limited ourselves in the concrete analysis of the bourgeois state to recognizing the general connections with the conditions of valorization of capital. Class struggles are brought in to explain the establishment of this connection at any given moment. We have emphasized above the problems involved with this procedure. It consists of the theoretical and hence also political reduction of class struggle to nothing more than the implementation of general laws. At the same time, the necessary result of this procedure is the interpretation of state activity as functional for the concrete situation of capital valorization. An attempt to break through the limitations of previous state analysis would introduce on the analytical horizon factors whose analysis Marxists have hitherto left exclusively to political science. It would involve, for instance, the more detailed investigation of those members of bourgeois society of whom Marx once said that they regard the state as their private property. Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law. The conceptions of bureaucrats have always been a factor left out of systematic analysis, although presumably they are the very ones who mediate the translation of the needs of the reproduction of capital into state action. But above all, class struggle must no longer be looked at in the framework of state analysis with regard only to their objective basis and context, but also in terms of their concrete course and results. This gives analytical significance to those particular conditions which are at the same time the result of previous class struggles in a society and also influence the actual pursuit of political strategies. They are partly consolidated into the concrete constitutional structures of the state in the present form of the state, but they are also embodied in certain traditions and typical modes of conduct. It is not that such structures determine the content of class struggles, they are important for state analysis as channels through which economic and political strategies are, as a rule, pursued in a society. Just because a concrete strategy may be possible in one country, say the setting up of the, quote, concerted action, end quote, in the Federal Republic of Germany, does not make it in any way one that can be implemented in a corresponding form in another country, even if the general conditions of capital valorization are in every way similar, e.g. Great Britain in the case of the above example of political class compromise. The approach put forward here, that the concrete activity of the state should be grasped as the result of social confrontations which are mediated through a wide variety of channels into the state apparatus, only makes theoretical sense if we think it conceivable that on the basis of such mediations, actual state activity is not always the adequate expression of the interests of capital as a whole. Not that the interests of capital are not in general implemented, but in a concrete analysis we should not assume in advance as a certainty that in a concrete case the ensuing state activity will further the possibilities for accumulation of national capital to the fullest extent possible under capitalist conditions. This methodological emphasis on the concrete course of social strategies could be opposed in particular by pointing to the increasing activity of the state in planning, which results from the acceptance of the responsibility for initiating the development of stabilization strategies. But the transference of planning responsibilities to government departments does not itself create a kind of capitalist superintelligence. It is therefore not only a matter of analyzing the economic limits of state activity, we must go further and show the limitations to which state activity is subject in its functional possibilities for capital accumulation, limitations which arise from the connection between state activity and the crisis-ridden development of capitalism. The difficulties of gathering information, which are customarily stressed in this context, can only be mentioned here, but assuming the very best collection of information, where would the responsible advisors suddenly acquire analytical ability? Where the responsible advisors suddenly acquire analytical ability. We will illustrate these points with only one, but a rather important example. Today, the most able growth theorists are absolutely clear that predictions about the concrete connection between definite infrastructural investments and economic growth are only possible as speculation. But even factors whose importance is not denied, e.g., the limited nature of oil reserves or the long-term effects of environmental pollution, do not thereby become guiding principles of state action. Where suitable plans do exist in desk drawers, let us say an energy policy less exclusively based on oil, they can only be implemented even as plans either if they are in the interest of a fraction of capital, if the working class presses them forward as massively supported demands, or if an acute crisis makes clear the necessity for them. That is to say, new problems must first become problems for the state. This is brought about through the channels for the articulation of interest and or through crises. The state reacts to both largely ad hoc, and as a rule, its measures create the preconditions for new crises. The logical analysis of the conditions of capitalist development The logical analysis of the condition... Yeah? I'll be out. The logical analysis of the conditions of capitalist development certainly provides no basis for understanding how state activity, which on closer inspection is amazingly unsystematic, always establishes, as if by a trick of reason, exactly that which can be regarded as functional at the time for the concrete conditions of capital accumulation. For this reason, it is questionable whether the commonly assumed degree of dependence of the capitalist accumulation process on certain definite state measures would stand up to fundamental analysis. We can equally suppose that for some state activities, no direct connection can be shown with the conditions for the valorization of capital. If such considerations are taken seriously and not just put down to historical accident, this poses problems for the materialist analysis of the state, which we have not yet begun even to think about. Dinner time.